Welcome to today's webinar. We're doing RTI, a closer look at implementation with Zumeta and Mike Jacobsen. We're here to talk to you today about how we use the NC-RTI Implementation Integrity Rubric in Washington State to conduct an interview process that helped the state's pilot sites evaluate their RTI implementation. During this presentation, we'll be talking about the rationale and purpose of this work, some prior efforts at evaluating pilot sites in the state, a description of the measurement tool that was developed. We'll also describe the interview process and the reports that resulted. We'll discuss how we ensured inter-rater agreement to make sure that scores were consistent across sites, and we'll summarize findings to date. After that, we will have Mike Jacobsen, who's the Director of Assessment and RTI Coordination for the White River School District, which is one of the RTI pilot sites, join us to talk a bit about their implementation journey and not only the work that they have done around implementation prior to the interview process, but then also how they've incorporated their interview results into their current and future planning. And finally, we'll discuss next steps. So to start with the rationale, prior to my role at the National RTI Center, I, being Rebecca Zumeta, who is the Technical Assistance Coordinator for the RTI Center currently, works with Washington State, providing technical assistance to the state's RTI pilot sites. And during that time, we found that 171 of the 295 school districts in Washington State reported implementing RTI as of 2010, and this was on their federal fund application for special education. We found that there was unknown implementation quality, so we found that school districts said that they were doing RTI, but we didn't know necessarily what that meant to them. And also we found that prior to developing this interview process, there was really just an unclear metric for how we evaluated implementation in our RTI pilot sites, of which there were 11 school districts throughout the state. So we were looking for a way to identify areas of relative strength and weakness so that we could help schools and districts plan for future professional development and also for their own school improvement efforts. And then we were also looking for a way to help the State Education Agency, which is OSPI in Washington State, to determine areas that required broader state-level support. We were also interested in learning the extent to which, or beginning to learn the extent to which implementation may affect changes in student achievement and also perhaps areas of special education concerns, such as the number of referrals that were happening per year, the accuracy of those referrals, and the number of students who ended up eligible for special education. So we were interested in some of those questions, which is what drove us to think about developing this interview process. The first effort in the state to try to evaluate some of the implementation work that was going on around RTI in the state. As I've noted, there were 11 pilot sites that we worked with in addition to general professional development support throughout the state. But what we found with those prior approaches was that they tended to be quite general. They were broad-level staff interviews where there were few scripted questions. And we found that in giving feedback to sites that there was a variable turnaround of those reports and also the kind of content that was observed in those reports. We found in general that the recommendations that were given were quite broad, and so it was often hard for staff to actually take the information and use it to target specific areas of need or of improvement. And then as an aside, we also did some staff surveys, but those surveys tended to be circulated to all staff in districts or in buildings regardless of their involvement in RTI, which made interpretation of those surveys somewhat difficult. So what we were looking for here was really a much more targeted way to do an evaluation of schools that felt that they were implementing RTI. Mike, do you have anything to add?
I think your last comment about the fact that surveys went to all staff was an issue for all the districts, and in thinking about it, it had to do with, so how critical is it that, for example, a science teacher, a math teacher, a history teacher in a high school had strong awareness of RTI in direct comparison to, say, the reading specialist at one of our elementaries or the RTI facilitator at the building. Now that person's knowledge base and awareness would be crucial to know. But there was a sense that just general surveys gave us a surface look, but didn't go in depth enough and didn't really provide a whole lot of feedback for us. Second issue there is it's kind of an indirect measure, so we didn't necessarily see a real tight relationship between increases in awareness and subsequent increases in student outcomes, probably for the reason that you've illuminated for us here. So just a couple of responses from a district perspective.
Great, thanks, Mike. So in moving into our next slide, we took advantage of this opportunity in our work with the National Center as a recipient of intensive technical assistance to use the integrity rubric that the center had drafted earlier this year. And this was made available to us as a kind of in its pilot version earlier this spring. And it provided us with an opportunity to structure our evaluation of our pilot sites in a way that would allow us to be much more targeted and specific in our feedback to help support those sites in their future planning. It also gave us good information at the state level about the kinds of things that districts were doing very well with, as opposed to the kinds of things that they were consistently having difficulty with, to help us figure out how to target our resources and time. And the Center's Integrity Rubric has several components to it. The first is that it provides an overview of the essential components of RTI, which, according to the National RTI Center, are screening, progress monitoring, multi-level prevention system, and database decision making. So there are components related to all of those issues included in the rubric. There's also a section relating to overarching factors, so looking at things like cultural and linguistic responsiveness, parent involvement, to name a few. And then across each of these areas, there was a rating on these in the rubric of 1 to 5 across the factors, with descriptions of what a 3 would look like, what a 1 would look like, and what a 5 would look like in each of these areas. So based on this rubric, we developed a structured interview that had 28 questions, and those were very precise, scripted questions that we used to work with an interview with 11 schools at the elementary level and 11 schools at the middle school level in each of our 11 school districts pilot sites in the state. And in this slide, I'm just showing you an example of what the integrity rubric looked like at the time that we used it. So we used the version that was available to us in the spring of 2011, and more recently, the current version, it has been posted to the NCRTI site, so that version is slightly different than the one that we used, but overall, the material and the contents of it were the same. And then to give you a sense of what our interview form looks like, I'm showing you the third page of the interview form. And the reason I'm showing you page 3 is that the first 2 pages contained just information about the demographics of the group being interviewed and the instructions that were used with the groups. But you'll notice that in the interview itself, there was a section related to each item that we were talking about, whether it was an essential component or overarching factor. There were interview questions in the second column, and then we provided space in the document so that the interviewer could type comments and remarks directly into the document and with recommendations, and then at the far column, they could provide a score in reading and or math if the school was implementing in math against what the rubric stated to be the equivalent of a 1, a 3, or a 5. And then to describe a little bit more about our process, we worked, as I noted, with our pilot sites. We had 11 school districts, and we had the RTI coordinators in those 11 districts nominate 11 elementary schools and 11 middle schools to be interviewed. We conducted the interviews only with schools serving students K through 8, and that was just a decision we made given resources and time and the nature of the rubric at the time. During the interview, we requested that a building administrator be present, the RTI coach or district RTI coordinator, at least one intervention specialist, and also at least one classroom teacher. What we were working for here was to make sure that the team was responding to these interview questions and not just the principal, to telling us maybe this is how it is in our school without necessarily confirmation that the teachers and other staff people in the building that worked with students also were in agreement that was how things worked. We have, again, as I noted previously, we evaluated in reading and math when it was relevant, and we asked the teams to bring and discuss evidence as it was relevant. So if they, for example, were bringing screening data with them, we wanted them to bring information about the technical adequacy of the screening tool that they used, so that we knew that they understood that this tool, the tool that they had chosen, did a good job of identifying students who may be at risk for poor reading outcomes, for example. And the ability to talk about that evidence was part of how we rated the school's implementation. And then with respect to our procedure, there were 4 external evaluators and 1 OSPI staff person, which was myself at the time, who conducted the interviews. And at each interview, there would be 1 external evaluator and myself that attended the interview. The interviews occurred during 2 to 3 hour time blocks with the building's RTI team. And those structured interview questions were asked at every single interview. And those questions covered the essential components. They covered fidelity of both assessment and instruction. They looked at instruction across different intervention levels, the primary, secondary, and intensive or tertiary levels. They looked at screening and progress monitoring. We asked questions about database decision making, and then overarching factors such as leadership, parent involvement, staff perceptions, training, etc. When scoring the school's responses, we made a point to score against specific language in the rubric and the definitions of what characterized a 1, 3, or a 5. When in doubt, between 2 scores such as a 3 or a 4, we would round the score down. We used scores of 2 and 4 when the implementation didn't exactly match the definition of a 1, 3, or a 5. Once all scores were completed, we also averaged the score across each implementation area. So for example, for all questions relating to screening, we averaged those questions to derive an overall screening score. Then we also rated any components that were just not in place as a 1. And we always considered any evidence that they presented when determining scores. And the reason that these scoring rules were so important was that, again, there were 2 interviewers conducting these interviews and listening to responses. So we wanted to make sure that when they were doing the scoring, they were scoring against consistent criteria to make sure that we were not only consistent with one another, but consistent across our sites. And this just gives you an example of what the interview form looked like on the last page. And you'll notice at the bottom, there is a summary of scores matrix that provided teams with an overview of their scores in reading and math across all components of the interview. So they got a screening score, they got a score for core instruction, one for secondary intervention, and so on. And then at the very bottom, they received an overall score in reading and in math as it was appropriate. So after completing the interviews, we worked very hard to develop reports for schools in a timely manner. And we used the notes and scores derived from the interviews to provide targeted feedback to those school sites that we interviewed. We included notes across the questions asked for both interviewers. We provided specific recommendations for improvement or future planning in areas where teams may have scored lower than they would have liked or where there was a potential for improvement. And then we used also those scores to help teams identify areas of relative strength and challenge overall. And what we found using this process and by reinforcing the need for a quick turnaround, the average time that these reports took to get back to school sites was 1 to 2 weeks. As an aside, we also revised the survey process so that staff directly involved with RTI procedures were the ones who helped complete the surveys. And this provided us with a much clearer picture of their perceptions of implementation. At the same time, it's important to keep in mind that this was really secondary to the implementation interview process, but we do feel like it helped tighten up our overall evaluation of implementation, both from a self-report and from an external evaluation perspective. Next, I'd like to talk with you a bit about how we ensured inter-rater agreement across our sites. It was very important to us to ensure that a school that received a score of a 4 in one school district had that score of a 4 mean something similar to what it meant for a school in a school district across the state to get that same score of a 4. To ensure inter-rater agreement, we had 2 interviewers participate in each interview. Again, one was a state staff person, which at the time was me, and that person attended as really a second set of ears. But in cases where there were scoring discrepancies, the score of the external evaluator was the one used in the report. So that's important to keep in mind that that second person was really there for ensuring this inter-rater agreement. The evaluator was the one making the final decision about the score. So again, there were 2 interviewers, both took detailed notes. We discussed items following the interview to make sure that we both had a complete set of notes when making determinations, but we actually scored independently following that discussion. And we required there to be agreement within 1 point. So if I gave a school a 3 in one area, the other evaluator had to give the school a score within 1 point of a 3, so either a 2 or a 4. There couldn't be a discrepancy of more than 1 point. If there was a discrepancy of more than 1 point, it was discussed and we agreed upon a score. And by using these procedures, we were able to ensure a high degree of inter-rater agreement. As you can see on this slide, the average agreement was high. You'll notice that there were some varying N values for the reading and math evaluations, and that was due to the fact that not all schools were implementing RTI in math. So there were a smaller number of schools that received the interview in math. We also used one district, both the middle and elementary school, to pilot the interview process and agree upon our scoring rules and scoring procedures. Thus, we didn't calculate inter-rater agreement in those 2 sites, but the rest of the sites did receive the interview, at least in the area of reading, which is why the N value is slightly larger in reading than in math. And you can see that our agreement within 1 point was in the very high 90s, and our 100% agreement was in the high 80s. So we were fairly happy with these scores moving forward and felt confident that there was consistency across our sites in terms of the scores that they received. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of what we observed in our pilot sites. This table depicts the mean scores observed in elementary schools across the subtopics of the integrity rubric. So screening, primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention, progress monitoring, database decision making, and the other overarching factors. Relative strengths were noted for screening, progress monitoring, and overarching factors. And not surprisingly, implementation scores were found to be overall stronger in reading than in math, particularly at the elementary level. When you look at middle school, you'll see that overall the scores were lower than what was observed at the elementary level. And again, screening was noted as a relative strength. Unlike at the elementary level, progress monitoring seemed to be a relative weakness, however. And what we found here was that there just tended to be fewer tools available to schools that had strong evidence of reliability and validity for this age group. So part of the challenge here was actually identifying tools that really fit the standards of the evidence required for progress monitoring at this level. Next, we looked at other factors, and we combined scores for like question types across the subtopics, and I've depicted them in this table. For example, we combined scores for questions relating to fidelity of implementation across each of the essential components to derive what I called a fidelity composite in this table. Then we combined scores for questions relating to fidelity of assessment versus fidelity of instruction or intervention procedures. And as you can see, fidelity of assessment was really a relative strength in the schools we interviewed, whereas fidelity of instruction was a bit more of a weakness. In addition, we noted this really across grades and subject areas. You'll also notice that use of evidence-based practices was rated the strongest in elementary reading, which again may not be surprising given the status of the research literature in this area where there do seem to be more confirmed evidence-based practices in the area of reading for elementary students than there are for older students or in the area of math. So that really reflects, I think, where the research literature is at this time, and also the knowledge base of many practitioners with respect to identification of these kinds of practices. You'll also notice that decision-making procedures were the strongest in elementary reading, although it was noted that across the board, few schools were using consistent and specific decision rules when they made decisions about instructional changes or student movement between instructional levels or tiers. With respect to cultural and linguistic responsiveness, we found that schools often struggled to determine how best to respond to this question. It tended to be somewhat general. So we found that although many schools had some practices in place, they weren't necessarily consistently applied. And we found a similar pattern when we asked schools about their communications with parents. At the same time, with respect to communication with parents, it seemed that there were more concrete steps that schools could take in the short term to help improve their implementation in that area by doing things like providing a parent guide about RTI in the school district, or by providing information to parents when students were placed in intervention groups. So now I would like to turn over the presentation to Mike Jacobsen, who's the Director of Assessment and the RTI Coordinator for the White River School District in Buckley, Washington. This is one of the state's RTI pilot sites, and he'll be talking about the implementation journey in their district and how they've incorporated the integrity rubrics interview process into their work.
Thanks, Rebecca. I want to reflect back on an earlier slide. I think it's about the third or fourth one that you did in terms of the purpose, and that's the desire to identify areas of relative implementation strengths and weaknesses. Speaking for my other colleagues across the state, we found this process to fit better with providing feedback to us that was very explicit and direct. And if you think about it, for us, it became sort of the backward design process, in that we had to provide, not only respond to the interview questions, but we needed to provide evidence that in fact we felt like we had met that particular indicator. And upon reflection, we just found it really helpful. The next part of this is to walk participants through the process that White River School District has gone through. And I have to sort of phrase this, that this is truly a work in progress, that we've learned a great deal. And one of the major concepts or issues that we would like for folks to take away from this is that implementation integrity is just absolutely crucial. The more we do it, the more we see where it's been implemented with fidelity, and fidelity sort of broadly defined, which looks at your interventions, your assessments, your multi-tiered model. It's just absolutely crucial. When you implement with a high degree of fidelity and integrity, you get strong outcomes. When you don't, it is very challenging at best. It's challenging anyhow, but it's very unlikely you're going to get those results. So in White River, where we began, and you'll see that we formed a district team 2006, 2007. We had pretty broad representation. We got a mini grant through our local educational service district. We, in conjunction with the service district, we then looked around the region for a high-performing school district in RTI that had a long history. And Tigard-Tualatin School District in Oregon has a long history. They've got a great website. At the time, they offered visitations, and so you'll see that we took a team to Tigard-Tualatin. The team came back, and we met and determined that what would be really beneficial to us would be a 2-day training by staff from Tigard-Tualatin, and you can see there the agenda. They walked us through their RTI model. They walked through their 3-tiered model, which now we currently call 3 levels with primary being equivalent to Tier 1, well, in terms of language, and then secondary as the second tier or level, and then tertiary is the language used to determine what we previously called our Tier 3. And you can see they went through their universal screening process, their team process, and then also shared some data with us. One of the things that we found really helpful in our school district as we have moved forward is to bring people together and discuss as a group what's the rationale for change. So we looked at our data, and we had been aware for a long time that we had significant numbers of students not being successful in the core, the primary curriculum. We had significant equity issues. We could not guarantee that a student would get the same quality or the same intervention if they moved from one building to another. And that just seemed to us to bring up some real issues about access, equal access. And we also know research and best practice support an integrated approach to change. And then you'll see that to further that conversation, we had a model that waits for the students to come to us rather than identifying early those students who are at risk. And we really believe that RTI in its best use is a preventative, proactive model. We also know we had limited resources. And then, although we've not directly focused a lot of our energies on this, the Washington Administrative Code, which is our state regulations, had been revised to incorporate the legal language from the federal government around using RTI as a component of special education eligibility. You'll see then that we took two of our buildings that were furthest along to training with a nationally known RTI consultant, Wayne Callender, and that was a separate grant that we obtained through the Puget Sound Educational Service District. And so as we did that training, we then created our vision for where we wanted to be. So how do we know that we have arrived? Well, first thing is we're never going to completely arrive because this is truly learning by doing, to quote a professional learning community's Rick DeFore term. But we wanted a systematic intervention process for every student who struggled. We wanted a seamless tiered intervention system so that a student going from 5th grade rolling up to our middle school who was being served in a tertiary intervention, so that we didn't have to spend a great deal of time with further assessment, further diagnostic workup to determine what the student needed. We wanted to know the spring before and being able to move forward in that next year. We obviously wanted better results. We wanted to make sure we evaluated our interventions. We needed to review our core programs to make sure they implement with fidelity, and in our model, we wanted to use assessment data to make instructional decisions. Interestingly enough, in reflecting back upon this, because I've not looked at this recently, we have made major strides in all of those areas. So it's satisfying to see. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but we've implemented a lot of that. So I think it's important that a school or a district look at what's the context of their development of this model. For us, that came through the professional learning communities model, and you'll see that was begun the year before, led by Janelle Keating, our deputy superintendent. And that resulted in taking the whole district leadership team to Professional Learning Communities Conference, and then implementing PLC teams in each building. Because it's important that districts integrate the work that they're doing into a comprehensive strategic direction, we made sure that we took time to let our staff know where RTI fit, so that teachers would understand that RTI is not the next new thing, that RTI fundamentally fit very well within a PLC process. And I'm sure many people are aware that PLC model, there's 4 major questions. The first one is, so what is it we want all students to know and be able to do? So that's your goal. The second one is, so how do we know where our students are at along that pathway? So that's your measurement model. And then the third fundamental question in a PLC process is, so that what do you do for those students that don't learn? How do you provide the extra time and support? In our model, RTI was integrated with PLC at that point to say RTI provided an explicit and empirical process that addresses the extra supports needed for students in a very explicit way. This is just a little bit of detail. I think I'll move through this pretty quickly, but the grant was submitted and there were 2 parts of it. We awarded it in June 2008, and you'll see the amount and decreasing support each year. And actually, though, you'll see here it was 3 years. It was extended for 5 years with decreasing amounts each year. So looking at this, we needed to provide some reports to our constituents, so you'll see what we did with the grant money the first year. So you can see that a huge part of this is staff development. So each building had an RTI facilitator. You'll see that we provided 18 days of in-district training for building RTI teams with Wayne Calendar. We had a very part-time clerical support for my work here at the district office to support the building teams. We had sub-release time provided so folks could attend, work with OSBI. And we had initially determined that we were going to send a district RTI team to attend the National RTI Conference in Utah. Did not do that, decided we could spend the money better with our team internally. And then you'll see there, we did the site visit referred to earlier. We also, on the right-hand side, that top right box, sent White River High School to Hanford High in Richland. Richland is one of our other districts who are doing some great work with RTI. You'll see some additional training that now we added 2 more of our buildings, and then you'll see the purchase of some tertiary interventions in the area of corrective reading. This is a more current perspective. We have continued providing training. We've continued the work of providing fidelity checklist, worked with our administrators, what to look for. I meet monthly with our building RTI coordinators, and we are beginning the process of fidelity observations. So to move forward a little bit, you'll see that what you should be looking at is the White River process for our universal benchmark screening. So I'll give you a little bit of information about this. We use AimsWeb. And so what you'll see at the very top in the orange, that's phonemic segmentation fluency, letter segmentation fluency, and then letter naming fluency. And you'll see that letter sound fluency, letter name fluency, we do fall, winter, spring of kindergarten year, whereas phonemic segmentation, if you're familiar with the Dibble type, AimsWeb type early literacy piece, we don't do phonemic segmentation in the fall. So the green arrows point down to fall, winter, spring, and communicate the benchmark assessments that we do at each of one of those periods. So then moving forward, you'll see first grade, we use math computations. We use RCBM, which is oral reading fluency. We do nonsense word fluency. At second grade, it changes up a little bit. We drop the MCAP and we drop MComp, which is focused on math computations of facts, to math computations and applications. It gives us a broader picture. And I do have to say that our general ed teachers have appreciated that, because if you look at the assessment format, I call it probe, it looks very similar to our state assessment. So there's some validity there with our classroom teachers. And then again, you see the RCBM. At third grade, what we've done is added maze, and we added maze because oral reading fluency is a necessary but not sufficient skill for development of reading, and we wanted to make sure that we're also measuring, in addition to oral reading fluency, maze, which is much more related to comprehension. So you'll see that model continues, and then at sixth grade, you'll see that it varies a little bit in that the research has helped us make this decision about RCBM only being done once. As kids move through the system, certainly by fourth or fifth grade, oral reading fluency is not as strong as indicator of reading skills as it is earlier. Comprehension becomes much more important. So you'll see we continue to do maze, but only did a benchmark in the winter. And then you'll see that continues through eighth grade. And I do want to point out that you'll see the very last one, which is our 9th, 12th grade. Historically, we had, for a number of years, probably 3, we did universal screening at the high school, determined that that took a lot of resources to do that, and what we got from it, we probably already knew because of our multi-tiered intervention system and our benchmark process occurring through 8th grade. We really knew who those students were before they entered 9th grade. So we actually put students in intervention classes based upon their 8th grade performance, and those decisions were made in the spring. But what we do benchmark monitor, although we can't really call it universal, is all those students that are getting special education / tertiary or secondary interventions, we have some that are funded out of general ed. Those students are progress monitored, but they're also benchmark assessed, so we can follow their progress. And I have to say that one of the things that we've learned by doing this is, in addition to serving as a universal screen which identifies students that struggle, it's been a very helpful way to evaluate progress over those 3 benchmark periods. So our data collection and assessment system, or data collection and display system, has been really crucial for us in moving RTI forward. Coming up, you'll see that we've done some standardized reading and math pathways, so folks know what happened. We put advanced, you'll see 4 columns. There's advanced, tier 3, which I haven't changed the language yet, secondary, and then tertiary, and then we've identified what kinds of instructional approaches and materials are being used. We have focused a lot on RTI data team protocols. I've had a chance to observe all of our teams at one time or another. In fact, just this morning, I watched one of our elementaries use Ames Web data display with RTI using the team protocols to meet with a 3rd grade teacher team to look at student progress on monitoring. For this last year, as I said, we added comprehension / maze. We developed fidelity checklists. We are doing 2 kinds of evaluation. You'll see that 3rd bubble, what we call kid graphs, or actually that's a term that Wayne Callender sort of shared with us. And so we do progress monitoring and benchmark assessment as a general outcome, but we also use the assessments that come with our secondary and tertiary interventions, and we look at that kind of data. So this morning what I saw was an Excel spreadsheet. In addition to Ames Web being projected on the wall and seeing our progress of groups of students, we then could look at Excel charts, Excel graphs that showed was the student at 80% proficiency on the assessment that was following Unit 5 in reading mastery, for example. And then we use data routinely to change instruction. This last year, this was a report to the board. There were several districts that were interested in what we were doing, so they came out and observed. We're building an in-house student assessment model to better allow us to track and follow students. This is our math pathway, and you'll see this is where I referred to earlier. You'll see the 4 columns, and you'll see advanced, Tier 1 core, Tier 2, which would be secondary, and Tier 3, which would be tertiary. So I'll take you down to the bolded, and you'll see that's first grade, and this is math. So our adopted core is Bridges in Mathematics. You'll see that it has, at secondary level, there are some targeted interventions within that, and then you'll see in Tier 3, or tertiary, what we call replacement core, designed for those students who struggle the most, and you'll see that we're using connecting math concepts. So that's math. I'll move ahead and show you reading. And again, let's just, because it's bolded, easier to see, so we're right in the middle of that. You'll see first grade. And what we use is, we've just adopted this actually for first grade. It's our second year, but we've done it K-5 this year across the district. We're real pleased. And you'll see that Imagine It is the core, so all students get that. And then for the secondary level, there are interventions within Imagine It that help teachers differentiate their interventions. And for those students who struggle the most, who are tertiary, the replacement core there happens to be Reading Mastery, which is a direct instruction curriculum. Earlier, you saw an example of the state data. So what I did is disaggregated, and I pulled out Foothills Elementary, which is one of our early adopting elementaries. And you'll see that I just listed the scores specifically. What we found is that working with their teams, that this made a lot of sense. And what we focused on were we doing screening with fidelity? What did we have at our primary level of intervention? What did progress monitoring look like? And were we explicit about what we looked at? And you'll see there's a little bit of variation there. We were pretty, our screening process is well in place. We do training. It's implemented with fidelity. That works pretty well. It works very well for us in reading and math. As was noted earlier, primary was not quite as strong. And an area down there, database decision making, we believe that is just absolutely crucial. We're working really hard this year on increasing the team protocols, increasing the use of team protocols that our folks use. This is a middle school, and you'll notice that this middle school is performing very well. In comparison, we've done a lot of work, in fact, around progress monitoring this last year, and are continuing to do that to make sure that we've got our progress monitoring protocols in place, that everybody knows and that everybody's following, and it's written. And when we have that in place, we are seeing much stronger performance in those areas. So to kind of summarize, we have found the rubric very helpful in helping our district move forward with really concrete and explicit guidance in what the model should look like.
Great. Thanks, Mike. So just to summarize, what we have learned from this process was that across the 11 pilot sites that we were working in, we really noted overall strengths in reading, which is probably not surprising, and also in school screening processes. Fidelity of assessment was another place that we found people were paying good attention to their processes and making sure that their staff were trained on not only how to deliver the assessments, but how to score them. We also found progress monitoring in elementary reading to be a relative strength. And then several individual buildings had very comprehensive and impressive systems in place. And I would say Foothills is an example at the elementary level of one of our stronger elementary schools in the state of Washington. And also the middle school profiled here was an example of one of the stronger performing middle schools. In terms of some of the challenges that were noted, and where we found some of the information on the rubric to be maybe a little bit more vague, was in the area of fidelity of instruction. That was noted as a challenge for many schools. Many buildings noted that this was something they knew they needed to be paying closer attention to, but they were just starting to think about how to operationalize that. They also noted the database decision-making, so deciding when to move students in or out of tiers or changing the instruction within tiers or levels in a timely manner was something that was not consistently applied across buildings. What we found was that data teams got together and reviewed data and made decisions, but there wasn't necessarily consistent rules written down for when to consider tier movement for students. Also, we noted that there was not necessarily a consistent implementation of tertiary interventions. Many schools had very strong and well-in-place secondary intervention programs, but the tertiary program just hadn't really gotten off the ground yet. Parent involvement and notification was an area that we felt would be relatively easy to improve, but that was one that many schools weren't doing in an explicit fashion. And then also progress monitoring and math. That seemed to be something that was difficult for a lot of schools, either because it was hard to find appropriate tools or because they were using some school-developed common measures that didn't necessarily have evidence of reliability or validity. And then one thing that was noted across many of the sites was that the questions around cultural and linguistic responsiveness and evidence of differentiation of instruction were somewhat vague. So some of the school teams were just a bit unsure about how to respond to some of those questions in the context of the interview. With respect to the feedback we received after this process, we were very interested in hearing from the coordinators who have been involved with this process for several years about how this worked for them. And what we heard from the coordinators and teams following these interviews was that they were more reflective about their current status, just the preparation for these interviews and the conversations that that preparation started, they found to be useful. They noted that it was timely and helpful for their planning. There were several schools that noted to me that they actually took the information, and because it was provided in such a timely manner, they were able to use it in that year's school improvement planning. They appreciated that it targeted specific concerns, and they, as I noted previously, they found that it just facilitated useful conversations with those RTI teams as they got ready for these interviews. I also had a couple of coordinators tell me that it was useful to have someone external come in and make some of the suggestions that perhaps the teams had been somewhat aware of for a while but hadn't necessarily made a decision to act on. But having that confirmed from an external perspective kind of helped them move that work forward. There was some need to clarify the purpose of the interview process, that the intent of this was not to be punitive or to identify schools that were bad, but really it was to help schools look reflectively on their own work and then also help the state get a better sense of how schools were doing with this and how we can better support them. So that it was not intended to be some kind of compliance mechanism, but really was intended to help all of our learning move forward in this area where we are all as a group, not only at the school and district level, but also the state and federal level, really learning about what does high quality implementation look like. So with respect to next steps in the state, a desire to incorporate these findings into the annual evaluation report that is done of the pilot sites that is part of the state's personnel development grant. There were plans to use some of these data in a preliminary regressional analysis to determine if the quality of implementation has an impact on student achievement or perhaps on trends related to special education referrals. There were some plans to revise some of the interview questions to make sure that the language was more clear and concise in places where we found consistent uncertainty about what the question was asking. Those were few and far between, but there were a couple questions we felt were worth revising. Felt that it would be worthwhile in the future to consider expanding the database decision-making section, and also, we wanted to create an opportunity to interview additional schools who were interested in having this kind of an implementation evaluation process done. So that was something that is in the planning phases in the state of Washington. There's also work in place done from the state level to really look at the results of these interviews and get a sense of what kinds of PD opportunities would be useful for these pilot districts, and in a broader sense, with respect to RTI, to help support the areas of implementation that many buildings continue to struggle with, rather than repeating areas that perhaps they're already well on their way with. There's also interest in investigating options for how you might do something similar with behavior. And then also, again, a goal of creating this as a process that schools can choose to take part in as part of their own implementation monitoring. So with that, the implementation monitoring and training is planned for early next year. They were currently at the end of the interview process in the late spring, 5 trained evaluators in the state. I have since moved to the RTI Center, so there are now 4 trained evaluators available to provide these interviews to schools and districts upon request, but there are plans in the works to train an additional 5 to 10 people in the state to conduct these interviews with districts that are interested. These interviews would be done on a consultative basis as requested by individual schools. So with that, we are going to wrap up today's webinar, and thank you all for joining us. If you have questions or comments, you can contact either Mike or myself at these email addresses, and there will also be a live chat opportunity coming soon. Thanks again.